Okay. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Jane Brennan, Vice President of the League of Women Voters of Central Delaware County. And I'm on behalf of the League, I'm very happy to welcome you to this third Hot Topics program of the 2021 year. As many of you know, in the past, our Hot Topics programs were a combination of luncheon with a guest speaker. And we do hope that at some time in the near future, we can do this again when we can do so safely. But we have nevertheless been amazed and delighted by the response we have had to having these programs on Zoom. As of earlier this morning, we had 62 people registered for this program, which was very impressive. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan civic organization committed to promoting political responsibility through informed and active participation in government, citizenship, and elections. Our motto is making democracy work, and we do that through registering people to vote, organizing and presenting candidate forums, providing candidate information through vote411.org, and hosting educational programs such as today's hot topic program entitled The Untold Story of Women of Color in the League of Women Voters, describing the early experiences of women of color within the League of Women Voters 100 years ago. While today respect for individuals and for the value of diversity, both within the League and in communities is a core tenet, we do recognize the need to increase understanding of this concept among our members and our community. Before we begin, a few housekeeping details for this Zoom meeting for the audience. All of the participants except the speaker, the moderators, and Kathy Youngman, who is our technological wizard, will be muted. The questions that were shared prior to today have been shared with our guest speaker. Ann Mazakowski will act as moderator for these questions and for any that are submitted during the chat via the chat during the presentation. Olivia Thorne, who has had the pleasure of working with our guest speaker at the U.S. League of Women Voters, will now introduce Dr. Jefferson-Jenkins. Olivia?
Jenkins. I'd like now to welcome our speaker, Dr. Carolyn Jefferson-Jenkins, a social historian and activist who is considered to be a scholar in the areas of suffrage, education, healthcare reform, and equity and inclusion for women. Dr. Jenkins graduated from Western College for Women in 1974, where she studied political science and education. After graduating, she became a high school teacher, teaching political science, history, and government. She received a master's degree in education from John Carroll University and a PhD in urban administration from Cleveland State University. She's worked in education for over 40 years in both K through 12 and higher education. Currently, she's an adjunct professor in the School of Education at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. I love her quote in the Miami University student newspaper saying, "My career had two paths. My professional vocation was as an educator, and my avocation was as an activist." Her passion for activism comes from growing up during the Civil Rights Movement and from watching her grandmother's advocacy. Dr. Jenkins has also been deeply involved with the League of Women Voters for many years. In 1974, she joined she joined the National Board of the League of Women Voters, and in 1998, was elected as the 15th national president of the League of Women Voters and the first woman of color to hold that position. She served as president for 4 years until 2002. She also served as chair of the League of Women Voters Education Fund, advocated for education reform as well as campaign finance reform, and she's worked towards putting focus on local elections while also increasing the number of voters who participated in all elections. I must say I'm proud to have served on the national board with her when she was president and consider her a friend who has taught me so much over the years. In addition, Dr. Jenkins is an author. She has contributed writings to numerous journals and books over the years. However, some of the works that she is best known for include The Road to Black Suffrage, One Man, One Vote, The History of the African American Vote in the United States, and The Untold Story of Women of Color in the League of Women Voters. On March 12th, 2020, Dr. Jefferson Jenkins was awarded the Freedom Summer of '64 award from Miami University. This award honors leaders who strive to advance civil rights and social justice in America. I'm sure there's much more I could say about Carolyn, but I know it's time now to turn this meeting over to my friend Carolyn and let her tell us more. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Olivia. It has been my honor to have worked with you in advancing the agenda for the league. And Olivia and I used to always say we brought the league kicking and screaming into the 21st century. For those of, and it's good to see so many familiar faces because some of you will relate to the references that I make. When I first joined the league board, everybody had to have a fax machine, and the fax machine was our way of communicating. And so when Olivia and I were on the board, we actually got computers and decided that we would try to use computers. And then after 9/11, changed the entire way that the league operated and lobbied. It forced us to even embrace the use of technology more, because if you recall, mail wasn't, we couldn't lobby by mail. It wasn't getting to Congress because it would take months for it to go through all the processes. But anyway, here we are today, and I want to say good afternoon and thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm glad to be a part of the Hot Topic series because the topic we'll be talking about may be hot. It serves to remind us that we now have an opportunity to do what Carrie Chapman-Catt asked us to do once the league was formed, to finish the fight. And we know that finishing the fight is a difficult task. So I want to thank Jane for serving in leadership. I want to thank the board of the League of Women Voters of Delaware County for their leadership. We live in interesting times, and it takes interesting and strong people to make sure that we continue to be as relevant and effective as we can be. I want to thank the planning committee because I know the amount of hard work that it takes to plan an event like this. And I also want to thank each of you who join us this afternoon, because you carry the league's message on a daily basis, and you'll continue to do so as you shape the league's future. And that's what this conversation is about. It's about recognizing our past, but also being able to shape our future. So before I begin, I have a disclaimer to offer. I do not speak for the league. My opinion and interpretations and representation of my experiences and research and analysis are mine. So let's keep that in mind. That being said, I usually try to make my presentations both inspirational and aspirational. But in light of the current events, you don't need me to motivate you. The election of a woman of color to the office of vice president is motivation enough to keep us in the fight. So exactly one day after Veterans Day, here we are, reminded that our new normal presents us with unforeseen opportunities to transform our thinking on how we value and celebrate each other. My mission now, and always has been, is to give that same loud voice to women whose stories have yet to be told as we recount history. I'm committed to using my platform to challenge you to consider how women of color's voices have been marginalized, and how acknowledging and celebrating their passion and purpose and perseverance will have a positive influence on all the future of our organization. So it's indeed an honor to have the opportunity to share with you as you kick off your diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging initiative, while recognizing the legacy of the suffrage movement's 101 years and the realization of how these efforts impact us all. We can acknowledge some progress, but we must also be vigilant, lest we lose any gains that we've made. So thank you for your interest in and commitment to learning more. The untold story of women of color in the League of Women Voters is the untold story of universal themes that transcend race, gender, and any moment in history. It reinforces the importance of valuing all, of telling the true story, of celebrating what should be celebrated, and learning lessons that should be learned. 20 years ago, I made several visits to Pennsylvania as president of the League of Women Voters of the United States. And it's certainly an understatement to say that things have changed in those 20 years. I stood before you then as the first woman of color to serve as president of the League of Women Voters of the United States. I come before you now, slightly older, but significantly wiser in this historic moment. Those visits to Pennsylvania awakened me to the rich history of Black women in your state that I did not previously know existed. And I applaud the efforts of those trailblazers, and I applaud the efforts of those of you who see the importance of bringing their story to light. So for all of us, as we move forward in this new normal, it's imperative that we recognize the urgency in this moment of reckoning on issues of gender and race. This afternoon is an exercise in discovery of contributions forgotten, erased, or obscured. And there's no need for me to give you an inspirational speech at this moment in history. So I want to have a conversation with you that will continue to engage you where you see fit, but moving us forward to a future that is inclusive. So I'm going to do three things. I'm going to talk with you about the genesis of the book and my thinking for writing the book. I'm going to challenge you by reflecting on the League's history with a game of 20 questions. I'm going to respond to the questions that you sent in advance of this presentation. And then I want to just engage with you in the time that's left and anything that's on your mind, anything that you've heard or felt while I was speaking that caused you to ask further questions. Reflecting on 101 years in this short amount of time is daunting, but it's a task that we're up to. So the questions and answers at the end are very important to me because that's where the richness of the discussion is. It's not what I want you to know, it's what you want to know. So question for you, why this story, why now? And my answer, because it's time. Carrie Chapman Catt said, if we learn from the experience, there is no failure, only delayed victory. And this is one of her more enlightened comments, and it's still relevant to the League today. And I say enlightened because as we learn more about League history, particularly on issues of race, we learn that Catt was a walking contradiction. And that character trait carried over into the organizational culture. On June 16th, 1998, when I was elected the 15th president of the League, a small but prestigious group, I knew then that I stood on the shoulders of the women of color who provided the foundation for me, especially the women in my life. At that moment, I thought about my mother, who we had buried the day before, and my grandmother, who at 95 lived to see her hope for the future realized. Neither could have imagined such an achievement in the segregated society in which they were raised. They represent women who labored, but never received recognition for their efforts to achieve equality and voting rights. And so this is what started my journey to discover the names and contributions of other women upon whose shoulders I stand. Those women of color who through their efforts held the League of Women Voters accountable to its principles. It is because of these women that I felt obligated to tell their story, to elevate their contributions from the footnotes of history into the main narrative. Telling their story does not take away from anyone else's story, and it serves to illuminate the efforts of the white women who also held the League accountable. The history that many portray is sanitized and romanticized, and it's a version of our accomplishments and achievements, the things that we're most proud of, mentioning our challenges only in the context of external confrontations to our activities or issues. That's human nature. Our representation, I always say, is similar to taking a selfie. We use filters, we get the right angle and the right lighting. But the true story of the suffrage movement has to be told. We want our heroes to be perfect, but history reminds us that they were just people. The unabridged history is complicated, it's messy, it's uncomfortable, and it's sometimes unbelievable on issues of race. But to be true to its principles, it is imperative that the organization's history, as recounted, acknowledges this inequity. From acknowledging these unpleasant truths can come a brighter future. Why is this story untold? And the best answer that I could come up with, it's complicated. And I am going to share my screen with you. Just give me 1 second. And I want to tell you a little bit about the genesis of the book. The book cover, and I was sharing with the group before we actually began the presentation, the photo has now become an iconic photo because it was also used in the National Archives exhibit on women's suffrage movement. But this photo was taken in Flint, Michigan on February 2nd, 1969. And this was the first time that the League of Women Voters of the United States used any image of women of color in a national publication and distributed it to recognize that women of color even existed in the league. The two women on the cover, Antoinette Curran and Mrs. John Epps is how they referred to her, but her name is Sandra. And I had the opportunity to speak to her. She just turned 86. The woman of color is Sandra Epps, and she just turned 86. She had no idea that her photo was being used by the League, the National Archives, or anybody else. And it took about 2 years for me to find out who these women were. It was just a photo that I found in the archives. But this marked a turning point for the League, a point in how we message and how we recognize the fact that the League was to be an inclusive organization. And so the book discusses the origin and the evolution of the League's attitude that's reflected not only in its imaging, but in its policies and practices, and how we changed and evolved to recognize that if in fact we are in every woman's organization, we must in fact have every woman in the organization. The relationship between the League and its members of color has always been an interesting study in contrast between principle and practicality. So the book tells the stories and some of the names that you may know and some that you may not know. And it begins prior to the passage of the 19th Amendment and continues through the 19th Amendment and beyond. And during the centennial celebration of the 19th Amendment, most books just talked about suffrage. And one of the things that I found quite interesting, even on the PBS special that was done, it never talked about the League of Women Voters, which was founded before the passage of the 19th Amendment to finish the fight, but the League was not mentioned. And so for 6 months before the passage of the 19th Amendment, the League existed and the League was doing the work, but the League didn't get the credit. If you've read the book or have looked at the Cliff Notes of the book, the introduction was written by Gracia Hillman, and Olivia will remember. Gracia was the executive director of the League of Women Voters beginning when I joined the board in 1994. She was the first woman of color to ever have been the executive director of the League of Women Voters until recently. And so I thought it was only fitting that she do the foreword. The other thing that I'd like to point out is one of the reasons why it was so important for me to dig a little deeper is that in 1998, Dr. Rosalind Terborg Penn also published a book on suffrage and women of color. And that was the first time that I had ever seen a comprehensive accounting of the importance of women of color in the suffrage movement. And that's why you will see me always use the phrase more than a footnote. In my research, there were instances where contributions of women of color were recorded, but it was always in the footnote. And so my mantra is we are more than a footnote. We belong in the mainstream narrative of history. And so the book is structured around organizing themes, not necessarily chronology. The chronology occurs within the organizing theme. And each chapter shows an ideological progression for the organization. It's interesting that each chapter really could be a standalone chapter if you wanted to do further research. But if you pay close attention to the quotes that carry from one chapter to the other, you see that it really is a comprehensive accounting. The first chapter is Lest We Forget. It is important. If we don't know our history, then we continue to repeat the same mistakes. If we don't have a historic context of how we have evolved and why we are where we are today, we don't understand the importance of what people have brought to the conversation. So within that chapter, each of the subtitles, we were there too. And for those of you who are on social media, I wrote a blog that says we were there too. From the beginning, Black women were always there. In the conversation, they were not allowed necessarily to be in the room. And I talk about examples of, it was not until the late 1950s where Black delegates and Black League delegates, and they were there from the 1920s and the names are there, were not allowed to speak on the convention floor until the late 1950s. Why was that? They were league members, they were delegates to convention. They should have had every right that was afforded every other delegate, but that was not the case. I talk about the Negroes Hour. That was, many of you will remember the controversy between whether Black men should get the right to vote before women. And it caused a rift in the suffrage movement and the organization because white women did not believe that Black men should have to vote before them. And so I talk about a delicate balance between gender and race. Black women don't get to choose. We don't get to choose whether we're going to be Black or female. We're both, and both are what is the lens that we look through. It's a delicate balance to say, I would love to say that I'm just a feminist. I'm not. Because when I walk into a room, you don't say, here comes a woman, you say, here comes a Black woman. And until we get beyond that, we have to walk that delicate line. And then a cycle of achievements and setbacks. So every time that there were achievements made and somebody pushed the conversation so that women of color could be included or women of color were seen as a priority, there was a setback of reality. And I talk about practicality and principle. There was a setback of practicality, and that's discussed. And then I move on to finish the fight. If we're in every woman's organization, where are the other women? And not just Black women, where are the Native American women? Where are the Asian women? Where are the women who were there pushing the suffrage agenda forward, but not visible in the messaging that was being given? For the sake of the cause. And I ask myself this question, as many people have asked me, why then did Black women even want to be a part of the League of Women Voters or part of the National American Women's Suffrage Association before we became the League of Women Voters? Why then did Black women even want to be a part of this? Because we recognize the importance of suffrage, the importance of having a vote, the importance of having our issues heard, the importance of not only having a seat at the table, which is the current phrase, but also having a voice at the table. And so I talk a lot about what was customary and what was institutional. As a grassroots movement, the suffrage movement adjusted itself to accommodate the situation in which they found themselves. And if that meant oftentimes moving away from issues that Black women might have, or the issue of Black women being incorporated, they moved away from it because that was not the priority for them. There were strategic decisions that were made to move forward at all costs. And I spend a lot of time talking about were we reformists or revolutionaries? We were bringing about reform, but we weren't revolutionary enough to tackle the issue of race in the United States. And chapter 4 is where I pause for a moment and talk about what were some of the lessons we could have learned from that hour. Why couldn't we have met our agenda and then move forward? Why was race a separate part of this? And why were Indians, and I use the term Indians because that's the term historically that was used, why were they also considered a problem? How do we navigate that controversy of what we're willing to give up to get what we want? Through Amber Colored Glasses is one of my favorite chapters, primarily because we always look at the world through rose-colored glasses. But I rarely have the opportunity to look at the world through a lens other than the lens of race. not because of my choice, but because of the choice that's imposed upon me. And so I live in two realities. Women of color live in two realities, but we always are hopeful. And so there was always hope, no matter how many times we were disappointed with decisions that were made or how many times we were left out. We always had hope that things would get better. And there were some turning points. And then I talk about the story of two Julias in 1970 on the national board. The 1968 was the first, let me back up for a minute. 1968 was the first time that a woman of color, Dr. Josie Johnson, was elected to the national board. After her tenure on the board, there were two Julias, Julia Ritchie and gosh, now I'm blanking on their name, but two Julias who were on the board, and they were the two Black women who started the Black Caucus. And so in 1970, beginning 1970, at convention, women of color would meet together, and they came up with recommendations that they presented to the national board on how to be more inclusive. And remember, I'm saying 1970, so now we're dealing with inclusion in 2021, but this was back in 1970, how to be more inclusive, how to get women of color more engaged, and those recommendations are filed away. This phrase ought to be familiar to a lot of people, the League Way. It reflects our identity as an organization, but it also talks about the crises that we encountered because of the League Way. The organizational focus changed, particularly during the 1960s, but this decade presented the biggest challenge to the League Way as more and more women of color saw the benefit of belonging to the organization. And so this chapter talks about the 50th anniversary and the 75th anniversary of the League and how we either changed or didn't change in certain areas. I was amazed to find that in 1966, Ebony magazine, which is the premier, until its recent bankruptcy, was the premier Black magazine, and everyone in the Black community read Ebony magazine. They did a 6-page article on the League of Women Voters. And they met with women of color from 20 different states and interviewed them about why they would be members of the League. And within that 6-page article are photos of the League president visiting, quote, the ghetto, and how the League was trying to assist in voting rights. What was interesting to me is everywhere else I looked, when asked about the number of women of color who were in the League, the response was always, we don't keep that data, we don't know how many, but Ebony was able to find these women and interview them. The League could have used that article as a catalyst to expand its membership, but they didn't. And Anna Diggs, whose former husband was mayor of Detroit, was one of the women that they interviewed. And she said that her friends wouldn't join because they didn't see where the League prioritized the issues that were important to them. And the same thing was true with Dr. Dorothy Height. They interviewed her, and she said that it was difficult for her to get women of color to even think about joining the League. And that reminded me, that 1966 article reminded me of back to the 1920s when Delilah Beasley from the Oakland area of California wanted to start wanted the National League to encourage the local leagues to allow women of color to join. And the response from the National League is to start a, quote, colored league, which she eventually ended up acquiescing to, but was a struggle for her because women of color, why should I join a colored league? Why can't I join the League? So that chapter deals with all of those kinds of things. And then standing, there's a section in there called Standing in My Dream. If the dream for all of us, and the hope was that the organization be truly inclusive, when are we going to be able to stand there and say, I'm not just a checkbox, I'm not your project, I'm not a quota to be filled, I am a League member. And then we get to the epilogue, and I talk a lot about how do we move forward. So the book, and initially some people thought that this would be a criticism of the League. I'm not criticizing the League, I'm pointing out the facts. and sharing with you the history, with the notion that by knowing that, we can move forward to the unfinished fight. And the unfinished fight is diversity, equity, and inclusion in this organization. And so I talk about our possibilities and our hopes and our dreams and what our commitments are. And then the appendices, that's where I need your help. I have a list of league presidents, a list of women who have served on the board. And then I have a list of all of the women of color who I could identify who were in some way, shape, or form connected at the national level or attended convention. But for many of them, I don't have their states or where they're from. So it's just their name. So for those of you who have read the book, if you can identify any of those women for me, please let me know, because that would be very helpful to me. All right, so that's where we are with why I wrote the book and where we go from there is going to be interesting. So I want to indulge you in my 20 questions, and I want you to reflect on some of the things I just said and see if you can answer these questions, because if we have time at the end, we're going to come back to them. My first question in this 20 questions, I'm going to give you a fact and then I'll ask the question. The fact: women of color saw suffrage as an important goal. They were there too from the beginning of the movement, but their contributions have been overlooked, erased, or included as an afterthought in many celebrations. Here's the question: if the suffragists were too true to the principle of universal suffrage, why was their relationship with women of color only transactional, dismissing them when convenient for the greater good? Fact 2, the 1913 suffrage parade that's used to symbolically represent the suffrage movement tells a powerful story of perseverance and power. What it doesn't tell is the strategic decision to marginalize women of color by relegating them to the position at the rear of the parade. Question: why then do we continue to use that photo as the primary symbol to represent the movement and the League? Fact: the 1920 ratification of the 19th Amendment was not the universal celebration it was touted to be. Women of color had to advocate for an additional 45 years with the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 without the full force of League support. Question: what would have happened if the League used its momentum gained with the victory of the passage of the 19th Amendment to secure universal suffrage for women of color? Fact: at the League's first national convention in 1921 in Cleveland, Ohio, my hometown, a group of colored women proposed to the League leaders that the League assist colored women in achieving the full privileges of suffrage. Because of the threat of Southern delegates to walk out if the proposal was presented before the delegate body, the board decided to hear the proposal separately and instead established the Special Committee on the Study of the Negro Problem, which was neither advertised throughout the organization nor funded. Question: why make this choice of practicality over principle? Fact: according to the US Census, some 500,000 African American women could, in theory, vote in states where their male counterparts were enfranchised. But in the South, African American men and women remain disenfranchised through state-imposed literacy tests, poll taxes, violence, and intimidation. Question: what tangible actions did the League take in the 45 years until the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to aggressively secure full voting rights for women of color in all states? Fact: from the 1920s to 1950s, the League national leadership allowed for the establishment of colored leagues. They were not really leagues, but units in Oakland, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Chicago, St. Louis, and Tacoma, Washington, which was interesting to me. I had to do a little more digging to find out why Tacoma, Washington. But what I found was that the shipyards were actively recruiting Black people from the South to move to Tacoma. And there was a critical mass of Black people there, and they started their own league. But here's the, there were also 2 Indian leagues in Wisconsin. So here's the question. Why was the national leadership willing to ignore its own principles and policies and values and allow segregated leagues to exist? Fact. The reported reasons for why Negroes should not be league members, they are uneducated. They're domestic and unskilled workers, and they had to be taught. The league attracted as members women who were well-educated, middle class, and progressive in their thoughts. My question to you, weren't the women of color who sought membership in the league well-educated, middle class, and progressive in their thoughts? Fact. In 1929, the Color Committee of the League of Women Voters of St. Louis issued 6 recommendations in a report entitled The First 9 Years. At its peak, the St. Louis League had 300 members of color. Question. Given that they not only paid dues, but carried out all functions of the league, why were they considered a colored league? And while they could send representatives to convention, could not serve as delegates. Fact. In 1946, the convention delegates adopted a policy to schedule league meetings at hotels that not to schedule meetings at hotels that discriminated against colored delegates. So my question is, why was it well into the 1960s that league meetings were still being held at such hotels? And I mentioned in the book a letter from Hampton, Virginia that attests to that fact. Fact, a 1954 Conference of Southern Presidents was held in Atlanta, Georgia in response to the United States Supreme Court decision of Brown versus the Board of Education to discuss with League state presidents issues of segregation and integration and the League's position on such issues. Question, why did the national leadership not have a position on segregation and leave the decision to state and local leagues to make about how to address the issue? Fact, in 1956, Eleanor Roosevelt, former First Lady and Vice President for Legislative Affairs for LWVUS, and former President of the League of Women Voters of New York, called the League out on its hypocrisy regarding race in a New York Times editorial. The League had an active agenda globally through the Overseas Education Fund, but did not tackle any issues related to race here in the United States. Question, why did the League find it easier to address inequities on the global front instead of here at home? Fact, based on available data, League membership of African Americans has never exceeded more than 5%. And images remained all white until the late 1960s and early 70s. And the question is why? Fact, in its October 1966, and I've said this to you before, edition of Ebony magazine, the premier magazine spotlighting achievements of African Americans, they wrote a 6-page article. They interviewed 20 women of color from 15 states across the nation who were active League members. Whenever requests were made to the League for such data, the response was that no such data was formally collected. Convention demographic surveys up until 1970 ask about everything except race. They want to know if you were married, how your husband felt about you coming to convention, who cooked your meals, who took care of your kids, but nothing about race. Question, why didn't the League leverage this visibility to increase outreach to members of color? Fact, the centennial celebrations that mentioned women of color focused primarily on the same finite set of women: Sojourner Truth, Mary Church Terrell, Ida B. Wells Barnett, and Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune. Few research further to access the names of the hundreds of women of color who made significant contributions. My question to you, can you name 20 women of color from Pennsylvania? And if not, why not? Fact, out of the more than 480 leaguers who have served on the national board during its first 100 years, there were only 18 Black national board members And between 2010 and 2016, there were none. Question: why wasn't the importance of having women of color's voices at the table a priority for the League? Fact: in 1970, a League Black Caucus met for the first time and offered recommendations at the 50th anniversary convention. At their insistence, for the first time, demographic data on race was collected. So the question is, why weren't their recommendations acted upon and sustained in part as a part of the organizational structure? Fact: the League has conducted independent self-studies every year from 1929 to 2018. Each one says the same thing about League membership composition. Each mentions the lack of diversity as a problem for the organization and recommends more outreach. Question: as an insightful organization, why was the League content to be known as a white women's organization? Fact: the League of Women Voters has systematically marginalized the contributions of women of color during its first 100 years through its strategic decisions. Question: when will we correct this egregious action? Fact: Carrie Chapman Catt proposed the League of Women Voters to finish the fight. She said, what can be done should be done. What should be done, let us do. Question: 101 years after the founding of the League, have we done all that we can do to finish the fight? Final fact: the events of 2020 present an opportunity to not only celebrate, they presented an opportunity for us to not only celebrate, but to commit to serve as a catalyst for needed change for the next 100 years. Question: did we accept that challenge? I pose questions because I don't have all the answers, and nor do you. The questions though give us a glimpse of who we have been. My question to you is, who do we want to be? Who are we going to be? I use questions because as I am getting a little bit more mature, I find that it's easier for me to categorize things. And so I want to make sure that we understand that we need to control our own narrative. We need to connect the stories that I tell and the stories that you hear that will make us a better organization. We need to protect these stories and we need to preserve these stories. Hundreds of women of color made commendable contributions to the women's suffrage movement and the League of Women Voters, many of whom you may never know because their involvement has been overlooked. But we need to make sure that we have a face to these women. It may be abstract, but we need to do the work to make sure that we recognize them. The League of Women Voters marginalized the contributions of women of color in its first 100 years. Telling their story now obliges the organization to take a candid look at itself and do better. Our past shouldn't define our future. We have a choice. Understanding this allows us to amplify the good and learn from the inexcusable. So I was warned that this topic might make people uncomfortable, but this won't be the first time that a League discussion or action has made people uncomfortable. The notion of women having the right to vote made people uncomfortable. School desegregation made people uncomfortable. Being called a communist made people uncomfortable. Women in leadership and being bosses, and on and on. There are consequences to being comfortable. These conversations are complicated but necessary. How many stories have been lost? How much of the true story has been changed? What will the next 100 years be like? How do we change the narrative of memory? We are more than a footnote. As women of color, I have the platform and I need to insist that our story is told and how it's told and when it's told and when there are competing narratives. I need to control for my own narrative. And any unabridged history is complicated, messy, and uncomfortable, and sometimes unbelievable. The current crises that we have of pandemic and social and racial injustice remind us that together we've made it through adversity and uncomfortable times before, and using lessons learned, we can make it through them again. It's times like these who define who we are. 2021 is testing our resolve as individuals and as a nation, and daring us to do something about it. We decided in the election of 2020 what kind of nation we wanted to be. My question to you this afternoon, what kind of organization do we want to be? Here we are celebrating 101 years of the greatest expansion of voting rights in the United States, the ratification of the 19th Amendment, that in its text granted women the right to vote, but did not guarantee it, and in practice allowed for the exclusion of the vote to women of color. And 101 years later, we are still addressing issues of voter suppression and gerrymandering and other challenges to the integrity of the election process. Disclosing the story of women of color in the League of Women Voters and affirming their unique challenges allows us to reimagine the organization of the future, facilitating inclusion, which is not tied to a specific moment in time, but is a part of our organization's fabric that cannot be frayed. This is a story that represents universal themes of passion and purpose and perseverance that transcend race. This is our chance to get it right. When the League is at its best, as it has been in advocacy and education on some pressing issues, it is a powerful force to be reckoned with. When it is anything less, it is less. The League of Women Voters of the United States chose the centennial to represent a major opportunity to acknowledge and honor the organization's unabridged history. And I was pleased to see the effort that was put into bringing forth the stories of women of color. It was time. So we embark upon this journey of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, knowing that things are not perfect. They weren't perfect in 1920. They weren't perfect in 2020, and they're not perfect in 2021. But we are entrusted with the legacy of the suffrage movement and challenged to move the contributions of women of color from the footnotes to the mainstream narrative of history. Let's do just that. We are America's storytellers, and the day's events force us to reflect on the reality of the past, challenge its legacy in the present, and choose how we shape the future. Every time that we tell the story of the untold story of women of color whose contributions have been ignored, every time that we celebrate women's political power, every time that we elect a woman to office, every time that we expose social and racial injustice and go about the business of eradicating it, every time that we make a change for ourselves, our communities, and our nation, every time that we vote, as some of us did last week, every time that we make an intentional decision to make this world a better place, every time that we protest or advocate for what Barbara Jordan, a League member, called an America as good as its promise, every time that we make courage more contagious than fear, we move beyond this moment and we make it a movement. And this is what we are called to do as we move into the next 100 years. My dream for this organization that has such promise is that in its next 100 years, it will appreciate all people in reality, not just rhetoric, in value, not just voice, in beliefs, not just benefits gained, no quotas, no stereotypes, no labels, no double standards, without the residue of race, an organization that is true to its principles. The League of Women Voters, my organization of choice, is positioned for this change. This next 100 years is about change. It's about building on the successes of the past and welcoming the opportunities of the future. I am more than a footnote. You are more than a footnote. We collectively are more than a footnote. So this is the path that I've worn. Now you can travel it more easily. And you do so by acknowledging our past as a prelude to the future, by telling the truth and using the lessons learned to do better, by moving forward, by imagining the unimaginable, by reclaiming the power in telling our complete story, by telling the untold story of women of color in the League of Women Voters. I want to conclude with these famous words by Mary Church Terrell, And this quote was from 1896. And she was an activist in the suffrage movement, as many others were, but her story is still told as an insert, not as an integration into the mainstream of League history. And she said, and I quote, "And so, lifting as we climb, onward and upward we go, struggling and striving and hoping that the buds and blossoms of our desires will burst into glorious fruition ere long. With courage born of success achieved in the past, with a keen sense of responsibility, which we shall continue to assume, we look forward to the future, large with promise and hope, seeking no favors because of our color, nor patronage because of our needs. We knock at the bar of justice, asking an equal chance." So this afternoon, let's make this our call to action. Let us pledge to remember that the contributions of women of color must be acknowledged in the mainstream narrative of history, past, present, and future. Why? Because it's time. Thank you. So now I get to answer the questions you sent in advance, unless you want to just move on to the other questions, but I did prepare some responses to your questions. So Jane, how would you like for me to proceed, or Olivia? You want me to answer the questions that you sent in advance, or move on?
Why don't we start with the questions that we sent it, you were given originally, and then we'll move on to others.
Okay, great. All right, so the first question, and I found all of these interesting, so thank you all for taking the time to prepare and put some thought into this before, because it allows me to put some thought into my response. And it says, since our league has embraced the national and state DEI policy, what strategies do you suggest to move this policy forward with our members, plus attract new members? And I actually was flattered to find that the DEI policy material, and Olivia will remember this is what we did in the 1990s. So I'm glad it was dusted off and pulled forward, and hopefully it will get some traction this time. I was very pleased to see that at Convention 2020, it became a part of the bylaws. And that then presented an opportunity for accountability, which did not exist before. But to answer the question, I like to use acronyms. So I would say you need to change your aim, your attitude, your investment, and your messaging. The A in aim to me means is simply don't see this as a project or as an aside. And when we talk about it, we always talk about DEI. We're not talking about this is the way our organization operates and here's how we expand to do outreach. We always talk about this is the way our organization operates. This is our budget and here's our DEI, as if it's something separate. It cannot be separate. It has got to be systemic and a part of what you do. So that attitude has to change. Stop inserting it in conversations as something that's separate and apart from what you do on a day-to-day basis. And there ought to be people around the table who I call the gatekeepers of the language. So anytime we don't hear, if I'm sitting at a board meeting, anytime I don't hear somebody talk about something related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, I ought to speak up. Somebody needs to say, have we considered? And whether that means, in some instances, if you're starting off new, you may need to assign somebody to do that. You're the DEI gatekeeper. You're making sure that if we're not talking about it, if I don't hear that conversation, I'm going to stop the conversation and say, we haven't considered. We need to consider this. That's a part of the attitude. The investment, you got to put it in your budget. When you're talking about how are we going to connect with the media, how are we going to use our social media, and you budget those items, there ought to be somewhere in that budget where your funds allow you to participate with other groups. Your funds allow you to make sure that somebody is able to go to events that other groups are having. Those funds allow you to have joint events with other groups. Getting a table at somebody's event that may cost $25, whatever. If you haven't budgeted for it, then it's easy to say, I can't do it because we don't have the money for it. But you need to put that in your budget, put a line item in your budget that gives you the opportunity to expand in that area. One of the more important things in the AIM, so that's the A and the I, the M is the messaging. I went even to my own local league meeting, and all I saw was that photo from the 1913 suffragist parade. Really, people, that's the best we can do? And I'm sitting here. How many times have I said, let's not do that? But they still did it, because in researching for photos, that's what they found. And so if that's what's available to you, that's what you use. We've got to take a little more effort and make sure. I wouldn't mind if you use that photo, but surrounding that photo needs to be photos of other people who have contributed, Asian women, Native American women, Black, who have contributed to the league. Make it more of a comprehensive thing. That's a project that you can give one of your younger members, and they can do that in a heartbeat because of their ability with technology. But when we message like that, if that's all I see, I don't see myself belonging there. I did a presentation and I was talking about the book, and there was a group of women of color who had come to this luncheon who were not league members and had not been there before. And one of the league members asked me, well, how do we get more women of color? I said, there's a whole table of them sitting right there. Not one of you have walked over there and asked them if they want to belong to the league, or why they came to the luncheon, or why are you asking me? And they're sitting right there, and they've been sitting there with you for an hour having lunch, and you had no conversation with them. That to me is a problem. And I'm not saying it was intentional, but it was just not something they even thought of. It never occurred to them to get up and say to these women, we've not seen you before. Why are you here? Or, how can we get you? I'm always asking people, are you a league member? Doesn't matter to me, wherever I am. That's the old president in me. It's like, you're a league member? But they didn't see a need to do that. They saw a need to ask me as the presenter versus talking to these women who they had the opportunity to talk to. And the literature that they were distributing did not show any women of color. So again, why would I want to belong to this organization? You have an opportunity that Olivia and I didn't have. We didn't have social media. Everything was word of mouth. Many local leagues, I just did one in Colorado, they have a podcast and they talk about different issues. And so their following has totally increased, but you can use social media, your Facebook page, just make sure that the photos that you're putting up are inclusive, that they have young people, that they have people of color, that they show you doing things that are active, not a bunch of old white women standing there posing for a photo. That's not going to help you get what you need into your organization. So what I want you to consider as in your next conversation, the acronym AIM, attitude, investment, and messaging. And you can expand the A's, because A could be accountability. The I could be something, however you want to do it, but change your aim in moving forward. The second question, and I don't know how much time, the second question says, with our local league's goal of integrating the DEI lens into our committees and activities, how can we encourage our organizational culture in that direction? I wish I had a crystal ball, because what I've been talking, this has been a part of the culture of the organization. How do you change the culture of an organization that is a grassroots volunteer organization and where people continue to operate where they feel comfortable? And so in order to do that, funds, prioritizing, and always talking about it. Being willing to have the hard conversations. I just had a very hard conversation with the group. They said, what we've been doing this read, what book would you recommend? I said, the book of life. I would recommend you get up out of your comfort zone and go to an event that you normally wouldn't go to. Talk to somebody that you normally wouldn't talk to. We have a community newspaper. I always scan to see what's going on. And if it's something from a group that I'm not comfortable, I go anyway, just to find out what's going on. But you can't go and never show up again. You've got to make an investment. And people need to know that you're coming because you're truly interested. You're not coming because you're trying to get members to fill your DEI responsibility. but that you're here all the time and you really are interested in what we're doing. That's how you get members, because we have common interests. And when I come to the meeting, don't make me feel like a guest. I'm there because I am interested in the same issues you are. I'm there because I have the same level of passion about something that you do. I'm there because I bring some value to the conversation. And the example I gave you of why they allowed colored leagues, if you think about how league meetings are held and when they're held, only people who are educated and middle class could go to those meetings anyway. It didn't matter what color they were, because that's when the meetings were held. So what in the world would make you think these women aren't just like you? And so in order for your league to do that, it's got to be a constant conversation, but you also need to push yourself. And you push yourself by the book of life, getting up out of your comfort zone and doing something else. All right, so among the evidence that I uncovered from actual correspondence, convention minutes, existing league histories, and personal accounts, which example, in your opinion, best explains why the league took the position that it did with regard to women of color? That is a complicated question. There is no one example that I could give. There's a series of things that happened, some of it having to do with the fact that the league, as a grassroots membership organization, operates in the environment in which you live. And so a lot of those customs and ways of thinking permeate the organization without us even knowing it. Part of the research I did here in North Carolina, the first woman of color to join as a member in Wake County, which is the largest county here right outside of Raleigh. Her name was Vivian Irving, and it was 1955. The league not only sent letters to National asking for guidance, but had a whole board research study done on whether or not they should allow this woman to be a member of the league. Her husband was a prominent attorney. She was active in the community. I mean, they were upper middle class folks, well known in this area. Yet, there were pages and pages of correspondence about why she shouldn't be a member and what would happen, how disruptive it would be to the league if she became a member. And in fact, when the National League did not really give them any guidance, they said they would watch the situation and that the Wake County League should let them know what happened in the event that there was disruption, and they could share that with other leagues. So the forward-thinking president at the time put all that aside. They were talking about how they would have to change the places that they met. They didn't want colored people coming to their homes because their neighbors would see, and so they could no longer have meetings at their homes. So where did they find a meeting place that would accommodate Negroes and not cause a problem for them, and that they would lose members? And in fact, they did. There were a number of members on their board who resigned, but the president was forward thinking enough to say that this is something that we want to do. And she became a member in good standing. And that's fine from the league perspective, but I always think from her perspective, what did that feel like to her? Because I know what it felt like to me. And so the fact that she was strong enough to withstand that and put up with that, to be a league member, says something. And so I use that example because there are so many other examples of just that. And when you talk to some of the women who were league members in the from the 20s, and I've talked to a lot of them who joined the league in the 40s, and things were just different, and they really had to fight internally and externally to be a league member and to continue to see the importance of being a league member. What I would say to you all as you embark upon this DEI journey is, take that into consideration. You never walked in her shoes. I never walked in her shoes, but in fact, I did. You never walk in the shoes of the people who come, but everybody who comes brings something of value to that organization, brings something of value to the organization. And that's how you need to view it. And so what is this person's contribution going to be, regardless of race or neighborhood or whatever. But what we do is we ask our neighbors, because we're comfortable with them. If we ask someone of color, it's because we feel safe with them. Somebody knows them, or we're comfortable with them. We never go outside of that. And I said to this group that I had the hard conversation with, you want me to teach you about me. What is it about me that makes you think you need to be taught about me? I don't understand that. Why can't I? And one of the interesting things about the DEI material when it first went out, it said, invite someone to lead. I wasn't invited, I invited myself. And then I ended up staying. I said, be careful who you open your door to. But anyway, I invited myself because I'm not waiting for you to invite me. I don't need to be invited, because if I'm invited, then you continue to treat me as a guest. And I'm not a guest. I'm a league member, full standings, just like you, all rights and responsibilities. I bring tons of things to the table, and let's all sit down and work on these issues and have these conversations. So there are more examples than I can limit to just one, but I gave you that example. And I'm sure if you look at things that have happened in your league, and if you talk to women who may have come and not stayed, you will get information from them that might be useful to you moving forward. Based on what, let's see, how do we, I moved on to that. Okay, so Germany took a strong position on Hitler, so citizens always remembered what happened to prevent it from ever happening again. What do you think of parents here not wanting their children to learn about America's history, and how can the league help with this? All right, so I am going to address that indirectly. And I will say to you that I did not, in any of my textbooks, see anybody of color until I got to college. And so if you take my education as an example, I did not think that Black people did anything of importance because I never saw them in books. There was never any conversation from any of my teachers about examples of anybody Black doing anything. And so until I got to college, I didn't know, other than the jet black jungle baby and Brer Rabbit, I did not know that there were Black people that existed. That being said, when I became an American history teacher, I made sure that I incorporated different stories. And I made sure that as a teacher, it was my responsibility to give the full breadth of knowledge of our history. And I did that through people and through examples and through making sure that we included different things. And if you look at it, the push that we have now in the United States, Black History Month, Native American History Month, which just passed, we do that because our textbooks historically have not included those groups or have included them in stereotypical ways. And so there is so much information and knowledge about the history and how people have contributed to the history of the United States that it would take volumes to incorporate everything. But now with the advent of technology, it's easier to do that. And so what I would say is we need to have a full and accurate accounting of history. I wish I did not have to write the untold story of women of color. I wish that their history had been included in books of history about the League of Women Voters, but it wasn't. And so I could not let this opportunity pass to not talk about that. My goal is that that book becomes irrelevant, that there is a book that talks about everything that happened, that we don't have to have separate books, because with a separate book, it's easier for you to put it aside or not read it or not be interested. And that needs to stop. What can the league do about it? And you heard me talk earlier about you have access to so much social media where you can get different messages out. Have a podcast where you talk about different parts of history and you bring in people and you have inclusive conversations. Pennsylvania, because of the Amish population that was there and the liberal population, there is such a rich history of women of color in Pennsylvania. But it takes a little effort. It takes a little more digging to find out where it is. But the league can do podcasts. You can have thematic kind of events where each month you do something that focuses on a group of women who may not have been represented in any particular way. Your Facebook page can have monthly days where you spotlight people. Your website, and your website is pretty inclusive. I did go through the website, but every opportunity that you have to bring to the fore the fact that this is not a white woman's organization, that history is not a white man's history. I heard a past entertainer who I won't mention said something that resonated with me when I was a history teacher. He said, history is a fable agreed upon. It is. It's the story that we agree upon to tell. And so I'm saying to you, expand your story. Make sure your story includes everybody. That's how the league can help with that. You have opportunities to do it. When you are doing your program issues at your annual meeting, talk about the different themes that you'll have for each month and how you're going to incorporate the league's work into those themes. And it's not that difficult to do because it's not as far-fetched as some people may think it is. Right now, the conversations are all about issues. How do we get people to vote? How do we counter voter suppression? How do we counter gerrymandering, and give examples of how those things affect different groups of people? How do they affect young? How do they affect old? How do they affect people with disabilities? How do they affect people with, I mean, there are just so many things that you can talk about, but you need to focus because you only have 12 months. And so if you did one thing each month, that would be helpful. And I guarantee you, if you put that out to your membership, and if you expand your sphere of influence, I was thinking we used to have college student membership and college clubs of league. I mean, younger people will do that stuff for you. I mean, they can do it as a project without being caught up into, I've got to attend this meeting and sit here for 4 hours and listen to people. You know, if they don't want to do that, fine, give them a project. And that project benefits the league. And that's how you get people hooked. That's how I got hooked when I first went to my first league meeting, and I was in my 20s, and everybody was sitting around talking about their grandkids and kibitzing before the meeting started. Well, I had worked all day. I'm tired. I don't want to hear about your grandkids. I came to see what the meeting is about. You can talk about that later when I'm gone. But there was one lady on the board, and she had been taking the bus to come to the meetings. And so I gave her a ride home. And then from that point on, she knew that if I gave her a ride, I would stay at the meetings. And I stayed there, and I eventually got hooked. You know, it's like, yeah, but we can do it this way. And we changed the way we did things to accommodate people like me. And then I brought my friends in, and it was a smart move on her part, because ordinarily she knew I was not going to stay. And so we need to make sure we do those kinds of, look at our structures. How are we turning people away? And just recently, we had a meeting here at 10 o'clock. Who's coming to that meeting at 10 o'clock? Your friends who are retired. We're in a university town. Come on, who's coming at 10 o'clock? People are working. And so, but it just never occurred to them because it was convenient for them. And so as we begin to expand, we've got to make sure that we do that outreach and find some ways to get people hooked. Giving people a project, having a social media person, that's how you get people hooked, because that's what people get, something that they like to do, and let them do it. How do we keep voters engaged throughout the year and not just at election time? Again, I go back to using our messaging tools and keeping the message in front of people. Many people don't know when their commissioners, county commissioners meet. Nobody goes to the meetings. We do an observer. We have an observer and we do a report. Well, who's reading the report? What about streaming things? What about having just social opportunities for people? And if at all possible, shorten the time that you have people together. Nobody's going to give you 2 or 3 hours anymore. They will give you an hour if it's worthwhile, but 2 or 3 hours to sit here and on Zoom, I'm zoomed out. And so, no, unless it's something I really want to tap into. Last night, NPR or PBS, I can't remember which one, had a hero. It's called a Heroes Welcome Home program, and it was an hour. I could give you an hour, and it was really worthwhile. But if they had said it was more than an hour, I wouldn't do it. And so look at how you're scheduling things, and you can break things up so that they don't take so long. There's business that has to be taken care of, but there are ways that you can do business. Just like you sent me these questions in advance, you can do things in advance. And so look at how you're doing things, but how do you get people to know that elections are important, that this year's elections were just as important, if not more so, than a presidential election year? And that's the hardest thing. When you only have 30% voter turnout or less in the off year elections, that's when you get people that make decisions that don't necessarily benefit you. I would be open to hearing from you how you get people. My thing is simply getting the message out, encouraging people to vote, making sure that we don't talk about vote 411 just when it's time to vote. That's a year-long project. I mean, we're collecting information year-long. Then once you collect that information, how do you hold people accountable for it? We never take it to the next level. So we've given you this information, you voted, and now what? You can sit back and wait for the next election? And pretty much that's what people are doing. The league can, in fact, encourage people not to do that by events that you have. And I go again to partnering with other people. There is strength in coalitions. There is strength in partnering because it expands the base of people that you're able to meet with. How would you spread the word that today's league is not the league of our mothers? I think that the national leadership is on a mission to do that. And if you look at the composition of the national leadership, it does incorporate intergenerational kinds of things. We spread the word by what we say and how we say it. Like I said, if you're having meetings at 10 o'clock, that's not spreading the word that you're not a mother's league, because I can't come and I don't know what you're talking about. Or if you're not on social media, I'm not going to find you. If you're on social media and I have to go look for you instead of you pushing things to me, I'm not going to find you. If every picture that I see is still of older women, I'm not interested. And so again, those are things that you can take care of. And then it's having the conversations. Each of you knows somebody, even if not in your immediate family, with grandchildren who are in, like I said, we need to revive the college leagues, who are in college or even starting back in high school. We used to have high school chapters. So we need to start looking at how we can reach into those intergenerational activities. And then one of the things that we struggle with here is we brought in a younger person, gave her all the social media responsibility. She's burnt out. Why did we do that? Why did we assume that because she was good at it, that was her responsibility and that's all she wanted to do? She wanted to talk about issues. She joined the league to talk about issues, yet we didn't give her that opportunity. We just said, oh, you're good at social media, go for it. And that doesn't work. So again, it's how we structure things and how we think about it. We just need to think about things differently and just continue to have those conversations. And the final question, would you comment on the article written by Carrie Chapman-Catt, Nassau president and founder of the league, for the NAACP magazine, The Crisis? And Olivia sent me an excerpt, but I actually read the whole article because that's what I do. And so it's interesting. The question is, well, the excerpt from the article, it was in The Crisis, and it was November of 1917. And it said, as suffragists, we believe that the vote will do women good and women will do politics good. And with the broad application of democracy that knows no bias on the ground of race, color, creed, or sex, Americans may stand united, not as Irish Americans, German Americans, Negro Americans, Slav Americans, and the women, but one and all as Americans for America. So would I comment on it? Yes, and here's my comment. I said earlier, Carrie Chapman Catt was a walking contradiction, and she was. She was a strategist. And so I would have expected nothing else in an article that was going in the crisis, which was the NAACP magazine. What did you expect her to write? She was a strategist. She wanted the 19th Amendment to pass. And so I say she's a walking contradiction because for different audiences, she had different messages. And I'm not judging her strategy. It is what it is. She evolved over time to the point where she actually was praised by W.E.B. Du Bois and Mary Church Terrell for many of the comments that she made about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And also in that article, and that was one of the excerpts, but she also said, for just as the world war is no white man's war, but every man's war, so is the struggle for women's suffrage no white woman's struggle, but every woman's struggle. Everybody counts in applying democracy, and there will never be a true democracy until every responsible and law-abiding adult in it, without regard to race, sex, color, or creed, has his or her own inalienable and unpurchasable voice in the government. Women's suffrage is but one, if acute, phase of the problem. The Negro question is another. The enfranchisement of the foreign peoples who sweep into this country and forget to leave the hyphen at home is yet another. And I conclude with her remarks, with all its failures and its delays and its harsh injustices, we will stick to democracy. As suffragists, we have a profound belief that with the enfranchisement of all women will come improvements in our body politic. To that end, Americans may stand united. So, you heard me also in my remarks say that these were her enlightened moments. Like I said, she evolved over time. Part of the controversy about Carrie Chapman Catt and how she evolved was surfaced during my time on the board when Iowa State was going to have a statute for Carrie Chapman Catt, and they wanted someone from the league to come and represent it. At that time, I was vice president of the league, Women Voters of the United States, and the president could not go. And I did not go. And I did not go because at the time, and I had many conversations, the students there and in the NAACP there were protesting the fact that that statute was being dedicated. And my comment to that is, again, we want our heroes to be perfect. They're not. We have to recognize the good that was done, and we have to use the opportunities for what was not done and should have been done to learn from. And I recently had a league ask me if they should change the name of they were giving Carrie Chapman Catt Award. They wanted to know if they should change the name. And I said, no, I have a Carrie Chapman Catt Award. And I accepted it on behalf of the women of color who were excluded. And I accepted it in her name as a person who evolved over time. So there, you don't have to just disregard everything that was done, but you do have to recognize that people have public opinions and private opinions. People who are strategists do what's necessary to get done what they need to get done at different points in time. And that it is still my belief that people evolve over time given enough information and the opportunity to do so. And so that would be my comment to that. And those are all the questions you sent me. Are there any other questions? I think we have a few minutes left. Everybody's so quiet.
And do you have any questions from later on that I might not have sent Carolyn? That's what I was trying to figure out.
No, we're good. And I just would like to thank you so much. I'm Ann Musikowski. I'm president of the League of Women Voters of Central Delaware County. And this has been fabulous. powerful. And thank you for answering our questions. And for sharing your research and your knowledge on the history of the League of Women Voters, and for your commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's been beyond what I expected, and I really want to thank you for all this. Our league, as some of your suggestions, our league did in our local program for 2021 and 2022 add a section about DEI, which states that our league will support the diversity, equity, and inclusion positions and programs of the National and PA League of Women Voters. And to that end, we did and are serving on the PA DEI teams and are developing and offering this programs on DEI as you suggested, and this is one. We've created an issues page about DEI on our website, and it's linked on our homepage. And we've put up the DEI policy that affirms that the League is an organization fully committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion in principle and in practice. And I just wanted to add that I was impressed to know that you and Olivia had this, worked on this way back. So I'm excited that we're going forward with that plan. And also on that issues page, we've put up resources and information about the whole DEI policy. Our homepage is LWV-CDC.org, and that it, like I said, that it engages all individuals, households, communities, and policymakers in creating a more perfect democracy. So I would like to encourage people that are still on the call or going to watch this recording to read the full text of the DEI policy. It is important to use the DEI lens to advance the mission of the League of Women Voters to empower voters and defend democracy. On behalf of our league, we welcome all to join with us to help create that more perfect democracy. And thank you again for this powerful message.
And thank you, Ann. And I apologize for failing to acknowledge you as president. I had you in my notes and I just didn't. So I apologize for that.
No problem. Thank you so much.
Thank you. One of the questions I would have for you is, for everything that you've listed that you have, are you also highlighting successes so that people can use those as models to replicate with their own particular groups?
Yeah, interesting that you mentioned that. And I believe maybe she's still on the call. We've been working with Jennifer Hoff, who's the DEI person at the PA League level. And she's asked us to be part of a subcommittee, Kathy Youngman and myself, to be part of a subcommittee to work on modules, learning modules to explain the importance of DEI that can be replicated and used through the entire state of Pennsylvania, and having leagues throughout the state embrace the DEI message. So that's one way we're hoping to do that. And Jennifer and the PA League have featured stories in the Communicator, which is the newsletter for the entire PA League. And we're hoping to do more. We have our past president, Barb Amstutz, has reached out to our Delaware County communities, bringing in partners. So what you said about, going to and being part of the other people's organizations, we're trying. So it's a lot of work. We're hoping.